Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. It's Doc Junel. The subject at hand is Human Anatomy and Physiology. And for this video, we are going to be talking about the skeletal system. I decided to divide this lecture into three parts. So the first part will be about bone physiology. And then the next two parts are about the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. So the next two parts are more of naming the different bones. But for this first video, it's more of how bones function, how bones are formed, how they are remodeled, etc. So when we think about the skeletal system, I'm sure that what first comes into our mind are bones. But the truth of the matter is, skeletal system is not only composed of bones, but of many other structures. So of course, we know that the bones, as you can see in the image, they form the framework of the body, or it gives the overall shape of the body. Some other components of the skeletal system include the cartilages. So somehow, nung discussion sa connective tissue, we somehow talked about cartilages. Well, cartilage are usually found at the end of bones. So usually at the connection of these two bones or in the joints, you will see your cartilages. And the role of your cartilage is to reduce the friction and also to serve as a model or a precursor for bone formation. So later on, we will find out na bones pala are formed from cartilage. Also, we have tendons and ligaments, which serve as attachment points. So tendons connect bones to muscle, while ligaments attach bone to bone. Together, all of this compose your skeletal system. Now, what is the function of your skeletal system? Well, of course, number one, it provides body support, or it keeps the body upright. So just to go back to that image, no, the only reason why we are able to stand up at hindi tayo parang piece of paper that fall down to the ground, no, it's because of our skeleton. It keeps the body upright. Yan. Next is important for organ protection. So our internal organs are usually protected by our different skeleton. Skeletal system is important for body movement. So the only reason why we are able to move is because when the muscles contract, they pull the different bones in different directions as well. Also, later on, we will find out towards the end of this discussion that the skeletal system is important for mineral storage. So, our bones actually keep calcium and phosphate. And later on, we will find out what the role of calcium and phosphate is to our skeletal system. And lastly, we will find out that our skeletal system is where blood cell production happens. So it usually happens specifically in the bone marrow. And the bone marrow, we'll find out later that it's found inside your spongy bone, in the trabeculae, etc. So doon pala nabubuo yung mga blood cells natin. So we are going to kick off this discussion with bone histology first. So bones, cartilages, tendons, and ligaments, these four are actually types of connective tissues. And alam naman natin, connective tissues are composed of cells, but largely of extracellular matrix, di ba? The cells are separated by your extracellular matrix. And the matrix of our bones, cartilage, tendons, and ligaments usually are composed of collagen, which is a protein, organic molecules, and water and minerals. In fact, these are the different matrices of the different components of the skeletal system. So, ang bone, ang kanyang extracellular matrix is composed of organic and inorganic compounds. So, we've already talked about organic and inorganic compounds in chapter 2, if you still remember, the chemical basis of life, di ba? So, organic, when you have a lot of carbons, and inorganic kapag walang carbon. The organic and inorganic compounds of the extracellular matrix of bone allows it to be flexible, but more importantly, to be able to bear weight. For cartilages naman, it's composed of collagen, which is the protein fiber, and proteoglycans, which later I will discuss. Collagen and proteoglycans together gives cartilages the ability to be a good shock absorber. Kaya nga they are found in between the bones, di ba? They absorb shock, they prevent friction, etc. And then your tendons and ligaments are composed mainly of collagen, which makes it very tough. Kaya we don't easily have our bones removed from one another or one muscle removed from the bone kasi very, very strong talaga yung connection na yan. So, we are already familiar with organic and inorganic compounds and even with collagen. But I believe that this is the first time that you are encountering your proteoglycans. So, proteoglycan actually is composed of two things. Proteo, which means it is composed of protein, and glycans, which means it is composed of polysaccharides or your carbohydrates. What's special about your proteoglycans is that it is capable of storing water, thus giving it a shock-absorbing capacity. Kaya, they are found in cartilages and it gives the cartilage that shock-absorbing capacity. Now, the bone matrix is made up of 35% organic and 65% inorganic material. The organic material is usually composed of collagen and proteoglycans. But the inorganic and the more abundant component of the matrix is made up of your hydroxyapatite. So hydroxyapatite is a calcium phosphate crystal. It's a combination of calcium and phosphate, and it is actually the one that gives the bone its hard and strong character. That's why our bones are very strong, our bones are very solid, it's very hard. It's because of the presence of your hydroxyapatite crystal. That is the one that gives it that property. Now, in terms of the cells found in the bones, we have several. And we'll start it off with your osteoblasts, which is found here at the bottom. So remember, when we have the word blast, it means that it is responsible for formation. So in this case, osteoblasts are responsible for bone formation. And they are also important for repair and remodeling, which later on we will discuss. Aside from formation of bone, your osteoblasts also produce your collagen, your proteoglycans, and your hydroxyapatite. Or basically, yung osteoblast, they produce the extracellular matrix of the bone. So this process of forming bones is collectively called ossification. So whenever you see the word ossification, it only tells you that there is formation of new bone in that area. Because later on, we will talk about primary ossification centers, etc. So that only means that there is formation of new bone in that area. So if there are bone-forming cells, there are also bone maintaining cells, and these are your osteocytes. Okay, I want you to understand that osteocytes are actually osteoblasts. They are still osteoblasts, but they have bone matrix surrounding them. Like in this case, in this image, you will see osteoblasts at the periphery. Nasa gilid sila yung mga osteoblast mo. But some of them would get trapped inside the bone matrix. And once they get trapped inside, then they are called osteocytes already. And these osteocytes usually live in capsules or in houses called lacunae. Okay, similar to your chondrocytes before, if you still remember from connective tissues. And as you can see, there are cell extensions to this lacunae, no? Yung mga lines na yan, these are cell extensions and we call them canaliculi. It is through the canaliculi or this small canals that nutrition, oxygen and other important nutrients would pass through so that they would reach the lacunae. So now that we've talked about the osteoblast, the osteocytes, now it's time for us to talk about the osteoclast. So whenever you see the word class, it means they are destroyers. So in this case, osteoclasts are bone-destroying cells. And the process of destroying and remodeling bone is called bone resorption. So again, the formation of bone is called ossification, but the destruction of bone is called resorption. Okay, so bone resorption is the process of repairing and remodeling by removing the existing bone. And what removes the existing bone is your osteoclast. Now, I want you to know that when bones are broken down by osteoclasts, calcium is released from the bone and they go into the blood. That's very important, okay? When bones are broken down by osteoclasts, you actually release the stored calcium, and this stored calcium would go into the blood. Now, bones in general can be classified according to the type of bone tissue and according to their shape. So, when it comes to bone tissue, there are two types, your spongy bone and your compact bone. And when it comes to bone shape, you have the long bones, the short bones, the flat bones, and irregular bones. So let's first zero in on the type of bones according to bone tissue. So when bones become matured, so once that ossification and resorption is already done, we actually call the matured bone as a lamellar bone. So if you still remember from connective tissue discussion, lamellae, yan, it's a very familiar term, right? It means that the bones have already formed or organized themselves into concentric sheets or layers, no? Yung sunod-sunod na pabilog, yung circular formation. So that is your lamellae or lamellar bone. Now, bones can be classified according to the amount of bone matrix relative to the amount of space within the bone. So, spongy bone has lesser bone matrix and has more space, while compact bone has more bone matrix and has less space. So, let's look at them one by one. This is your spongy bone. Again, as mentioned, there is less matrix and more spaces. That's your spongy bone. They are composed of rods and plates. Kita nyo naman dito, diba? You can see those rods and plate formation. And we call this the trabeculae. Ayan. So that those formation that parang maze-like or net-like formation of the spongy bone, you call that the trabeculae. And in between the spaces found in your trabeculae, this is where the bone marrow will actually lodge into. And we know what happens in the bone marrow. Blood cells are formed inside the bone marrow. So, spongy bone are formed in this way. There will be a single layer of osteoblasts surrounding an ossification center. And then they will start to deposit bone matrix towards the middle. And as they do that, some osteoblasts would get trapped inside. And now they become osteocytes. Important to note that in spongy bone, you will not find the osteons, diba? Osteons or Haversian system are the functional unit of a bone, and you won't find that in a spongy bone. So this is how a spongy bone would look like under the microscope or upon closer inspection. Under the microscope, this is how it would look like. This is the normal bone specimen. These ones highlighted in blue, these are the bone, the trabeculae. Those parang net-like or maze-like formation. And this one here, the ones highlighted in blue in this image, are the spaces where you will find the bone marrow. Now, in compact bone naman, compact bone is also called cortical bone. This is the solid and outer layer surrounding each bone. So commonly, we will find our compact bones in each and every bone naman may compact bone, but they are usually found in the outer layer, giving it the strong and that solid formation of the bone. Now, it is in the compact bone that you will find the osteons, or the functional unit of a compact bone. And the osteon, as you can see here, it's composed of concentric rings, diba? Surrounding a central canal. Yeah, this is the central canal. Here's a central canal as well. So what do we find inside the central canal? We will find blood vessels, nerves, and loose connective tissue inside. So this is one osteon, another one. So you see several osteons in a compact bone. Okay? So here is a closer image of an osteon. You see in the middle, the central canal. You see this lacunae housing your osteocytes. You see also the canaliculi, no, yung mga lines na yan. And that circular formation, you call that the lamellae, or the lamellar formation, diba? Now, if we talk about bones and their shapes, then we have several. We have long bones. Usually you find them in the thigh bone or the femur, the tibia and fibula, which is the leg bone, and the phalanges, which are our fingers, which later on in the second and third video, we will be talking about this, yung mga names ng mga iba't ibang bones. So this is how a long bone would look like, no? By the name itself, they appear long. Yeah. Next, we have short bones. Yeah. They are shorter, more circular information. Usually, you find them in your wrist and your foot. So carpals and tarsals. We also have flat bones, which are usually found in the skull, in the ribs, and even in our chest. So in your sternum and skull. And then we also have irregularly shaped bones. Ito yung mga bones na you cannot really define their shape. No? That's why they are called irregular. So usually they are found in our face, facial bone, and in the vertebrae or in the spine. Yeah. So I introduced to you the bone shapes because I want to talk about the structure of a long bone. So we're going to focus on that. This is how a long bone would look like. So first, I want to introduce to you the diaphysis. Ito yung diaphysis, the body or the longer part of the bone. Yan. So it is the shaft, as they would say. Now, the sides of your diaphysis, it's actually composed of compact bone. Yung kita niyo yung gilid, very solid, very compact. There are no spaces on the side. But in the middle of it is a hollow cavity. And that hollow cavity is called the medullary cavity. Now, what is found inside the medullary cavity? They are actually your bone marrow as well. So we mentioned earlier that bone marrow is found in the spaces of the trabeculae ng spongy bone, but they are also found in the medullary cavity. Okay? And again, what's the purpose of your bone marrow? Formation of blood cells. So that's your diaphysis. Now, the ends of a long bone, this one, this circular area here, we call that the epiphysis. Okay? Epiphysis. So if it's letter I, it's singular. If it's letter E, it's plural. Okay? So both will be accepted. So the ends of the long bones are usually composed of spongy bone inside with an outer layer of compact bone. Yan yung formation niya. Okay? And we know what happens inside the spongy bone, di ba? You have your trabeculae, your bone marrow, etc. Now, outside the epiphysis is a thin layer of cartilage, and we call that the articular cartilage. In English, when you say articulation, it means connection. So basically, in this sense, the articular cartilage is the one that helps connect this bone to the next bone. Ganon siya. And they reduce friction, and it also prevents pain whenever we move the long bones. Now, I want you to focus on this area here. This is what we call the epiphyseal plate. This is very, very important, no? Especially in the growth of a bone. So the epiphyseal plate is usually found between the epiphysis and the diaphysis. And this is the site for the growth of a bone in length. So when in children, meron silang epiphyseal plate. They do have an epiphyseal plate. And as they grow older, it is the epiphyseal plate that adds the length of the bone. Okay? And once we reach adulthood and we have already maxed out our height, or we have already reached our height, then the epiphyseal plate will become ossified. What do we mean by ossified? It will become bone and it will stop growing. And once it forms a bone already, from being called the epiphyseal plate, you will now call it the epiphyseal line. Okay, so epiphyseal plate, when it is still capable of growth, of lengthening the bone, but once it is already it has already stopped producing length, then you call it the epiphyseal line. So as mentioned, the medullary cavity is found at the center of the diaphysis. It is a cavity and that is filled with a soft tissue called the marrow. And there usually we have two types of bone marrow. We have the red marrow and the yellow marrow. So it is the red marrow that is capable of producing the blood cells, while the yellow marrow is mostly fat. Okay? So in fetuses, in babies found inside the womb, the spaces within the bones are filled with red marrow. Puro red marrow yan before we get born. But just before our birth, the red bone marrow will start to convert to yellow. And as we grow older into adulthood, more red bone marrow becomes converted into yellow. Until in adulthood, most red bone marrow are only found in the flat bones na lang. Flat bones like in the skull, in the chest, in the ribs, while the medullary cavity of the long bones will now contain yellow marrow. So wala nang red bone marrow once we become adults sa mga long bones natin. Next, I want to introduce to you the periosteum. So the periosteum here, no, it is the outer surface of the bone. Siya yung outermost covering of the bone. So it is composed of a connective tissue membrane, and the periosteum contains your blood vessels, your nerves, no? That's why when you hit somebody, you will feel pain because there are also nerve endings at outside of your bones. And it is through the periosteum where your tendons and ligaments would attach to. Kasi diba tendons, these are connection of bone to muscle. So the muscles would attach to the periosteum. And the ligaments naman, connection of bone to bone. So yan, dyan sila nagko-connect sa periosteum. And the inner part of the medullary cavity, it is also lined by a connective tissue called endosteum. So endo meaning inside, no? Endosteum. So it is composed of a single layer of connective tissue that lines the internal surface of the cavities. So they line the medullary cavity. So now we're going to be talking about bone formation. So bone formation occurs in two processes. The first is intramembranous ossification, and the second is endochondral ossification. Now, intramembranous ossification starts while we are inside the womb of our mothers. So, from the connective tissue membranes, bones will form in those areas. While in endochondral ossification, it also begins while we are in the womb of our mothers, but the starting material is from cartilage. Okay? And both types of bone formation results in both compact, and spongy bone. So we are first going to be talking about intramembranous ossification. As mentioned, the starting material in intramembranous ossification are connective tissue. So the osteoblast will begin to produce bone inside this connective tissue. So as you can see in this image, you can see the surrounding. These are all connective tissue. And then you see the osteoblast lining up, and they will start to produce bone matrix inside, no? And you can see also the trapped osteoblast, which will eventually become your osteocytes. Usually, intramembranous ossification occurs in the bones of the skull. Okay? So, yung intramembranous ossification na yan, it usually occurs in the skull. It might be asked in the exam. So, how does intramembranous ossification happen? First, the osteoblasts within the center of ossification will produce bone matrix around the connective tissue membrane. So this is the first step. You can see here the osteoblast lining up, and they are producing this brown thing. That's the bone matrix. And once the osteoblasts are embedded, or once they are trapped inside the bone matrix, the osteoblast will become osteocytes. So as mentioned, itong mga nasa loob, this one's inside, this will eventually become your osteocytes. And that space where they are found, that's going to be the lacuna. And as you can see in intramembranous ossification, you will find the formation of many tiny trabeculae. Yan. As additional osteoblasts gather on the surface of the trabeculae, as you can see here, more from having only 1, 2, 3, 4, here you have a lot already of osteoblasts lining up, no? So more osteoblasts will gather on the surface of the trabeculae and will produce more bone. Thus, the trabeculae will become larger. So as you can see here, mas lumaki na yung mga spaces, no? And spongy bone will start to form as the trabeculae join together. Lastly, the cells within the spaces of the spongy bone will become your red bone marrow and will also produce your blood cells. While the osteoblasts outside, they form the periosteum by laying down bone matrix on the outer surface of the compact bone. So that is how your intramembranous ossification happens. Next is your endochondral ossification. And as mentioned, the starting material here is a cartilage model. So what happens is that the cartilage model is replaced by a bone. Endochondral ossification happens in all bones except for the skull, because in the skull, intramembranous ossification is the one that happens. So in endochondral ossification, you will find the primary ossification center and the secondary ossification center. The primary center is found in the diaphysis, or in the shaft or body of a long bone, while the secondary ossification center is found in the epiphysis, or in the ends of the long bones. So how does it happen? Yan. First, you have to form the cartilage model. So this is the cartilage model, and of course, it will be formed by your chondroblasts, di ba? Again, blasts are forming cells. So they are cartilage forming cells, tong chondroblast. So they create first the cartilage model. And yung mga chondroblasts, which are trapped inside the cartilage, will become your chondrocytes. Alright? So after number 1, you already formed the cartilage model. In number 2, a bone collar will form. So this is the bone collar. So what happens here is osteoblasts will start to line up on the sides, no? And will start to produce your bone matrix. Thus, the cartilage model will start to calcify or to harden. So as osteoblasts invade the calcified cartilage, it will now form the primary ossification center in the diaphysis. So in a cartilage, the first one that calcifies is the diaphysis. Okay, so now you can see more bone matrix here. There is also a blood vessel now providing the nutrients, the oxygen needed by the long bone. And then eventually, once it is already finished calcifying the diaphysis, it will go now to the secondary ossification center in the epiphysis, until the original cartilage model is completely ossified, and the only remaining cartilage will be the articular cartilage at the very end of the long bone. Okay? And here we can see the epiphyseal plate, but once it is already finished, you will see now the epiphyseal line. Yan na lang makikita natin. Okay? So again, we have two types of bone formation: intramembranous ossification and endochondral ossification. Now, in terms of bone growth, there are also two types. Bone growth in width, which is also called appositional growth. So here is a good image of it. Paano ba lumalapad, or how does a bone grow in its width? So it is through the deposition of new bone onto the existing bone. So if this is the bone in infancy or in childhood, then bones will get deposited on the outer part of it. So more bone will be formed on the outer part, while the inner part naman will be removed by your osteoclast, so that the medullary cavity will also increase in size. So more bones outside and then more space inside. That's what happens in appositional growth. So here, osteoblasts will deposit new bone matrix on the surface of the bone, increasing its width or diameter. And this process is called appositional growth. So let's see if I can play this video. If not, then I'll just show it in another instance. All right. So next is bone growth in length. And when we call bone growth in length, it is also called endochondral growth. Endochondral because remember, this is where the epiphyseal plate is found. So the growth in length of a bone, which is the major source of the increase in height, occurs in the epiphyseal plate. And this bone growth occurs through endochondral ossification, as mentioned earlier. So first, it begins here. This is the cartilage, no, the purple part. You will see chondrocytes increasing in number. So more chondrocytes are trapped inside the cartilage. As you can see, dumadami sila. And then, these chondrocytes will enlarge and they will die. So as you can see here, the cells will start to increase in its size and they lose the nucleus. No, they lose their nucleus, meaning they have already died. This cartilage matrix, this from being purple, they start to become pink here, no? This means that they are starting to become calcified. All right, they start to become calcified. And in this area here at the bottom, you will see already your osteoblasts. You will see your osteoblasts already forming the bone around it. So that is how endochondral growth would happen. So the osteoblast will start depositing bone on the surface, and this produces bone on the diaphysis and the epiphyseal side of the epiphyseal plate. So we have different timetable for human ossification. So in the 3rd month of pregnancy, the ossification in the long bones already begin. On the 4th month, the primary ossification at the diaphysis of the long bone already is formed. From birth up to 5 years, the secondary ossification will start to appear. And then from 5 years old until puberty, 12 years old in females and 14 in males, there is rapid ossification or rapid growth of this ossification centers. So, yan, tumatangkad, di ba? Yan yung tinatawag na growth spurt. Once we reach 17 to 20 years old, the bones of the upper arms, the upper limbs, have completely ossified. So, once you reach 20 years old, your arms will no longer grow in length. From 18 to 23, the bones of the legs or the lower limbs will become completely ossified. So once you reach the age of 23, wala na pong chance that you will grow in height. Okay? While 20 to 25, the bones of the sternum or the chest and the vertebrae will also stop growing. So by the age of 25, all our bones have already completely ossified. Now, what will happen if there is an abnormal bone growth? How will we be able to correct that? So we'll be able to correct that through bone remodeling. So in bone remodeling, you will remove the existing bone by the use of your osteoclast, and you will form new bone by the use of your osteoblasts. So all our bones all over the body occurs or undergoes bone remodeling. And this is responsible for the changes in bone shape, in bone repair, in adjustment of bone to stress, and even in calcium ion regulation. So as we grow older, all our bones undergo remodeling. So what if a bone is broken? How does bone repair happen? So when a broken bone, when we have broken bones, as you can see in this X-ray, it will cause bleeding and a hematoma will form. What is hematoma? A hematoma is a collection of blood. So syempre, when you break this bone, you will also break the blood vessels. And blood will come out of the blood vessels being collected here inside. So makokollect yung blood dito. So you will have a hematoma formation. Afterwards, a callus will form, which is a bone cartilage network between and around the bone fragments. So as you can see, from being blood cells, they will be replaced by a callus, by cartilage, and then those cartilage will eventually become bone. Okay? So the spongy bone will replace the callus, and the compact bone will replace the spongy bone. So that is the process. Hematoma, that's the first one. A callus, that's a second one. Spongy bone, that's a third one. And then compact bone, that's the fourth one. That is how bone repair happens. That is why when we have broken bones, you have to be able to keep this in its proper place. Kailangan mag-connect yung dalawang yan. That's why we put cement. That's why we put splint or immobilizers. Because if not, then the bone repair will not happen properly. No, it will not happen properly. Lastly, we'll be talking about bone and calcium homeostasis. So we mentioned earlier that the skeletal system serves as a storage site for both calcium and phosphate. So the movement of calcium in and out of the bones actually dictate the amount of calcium in the blood. So yun pala yung nagdi-dictate, no? Yun pala yung nagsasabi if there will be increase or decrease of calcium in the blood. It is the movement of calcium in and out of the bones. So if you still remember, I mentioned earlier that when osteoclasts break down bone, you actually release calcium out of the bone and into the blood. Diba? While your osteoblasts actually do the opposite thing. When osteoblasts build new bone, it actually causes calcium to move into the bone from the blood. Kuha? So calcium, if they are in the blood, the osteoblast will be the one to get calcium out of the blood and into the bone. While the osteoclast, when they break down bone, they bring calcium from the bone into the blood. Now, what dictates this bone formation and bone resorption? It is your hormones, specifically your parathyroid hormones and calcitonin. So we'll be talking about this. So calcium is a critical nutrient not only for the bones, but it is also important for muscle contraction. So once we go into the muscular system, you will realize na ang calcium pala is also important for muscle contraction. Also, calcium is important for exocytosis, if you still remember. Diba? We talked about this in the in the synapses. If you remember, in the synapse, it is calcium, diba, that causes exocytosis of your neurotransmitters. So, since calcium has many functions, it is important that calcium is regulated properly inside the body. So, first we have the parathyroid hormone or PTH. So, the parathyroid hormone is produced by your parathyroid gland. Where do you find your parathyroid gland? It's actually at the neck area. It is behind the thyroid. Thus, the name parathyroid, meaning behind the thyroid. So what the PTH does, once the parathyroid gland produces the PTH, what it does is that it increases the formation and activation of osteoclast. So pinaparami ni PTH ang osteoclasts mo. And we know that osteoclasts are the bone reabsorbing cells or the bone destructing cells. So what PTH does is that it stimulates the reabsorption of calcium from the urine in the kidney, thereby reducing the amount of calcium that is thrown into the urine. So we normally have calcium in our urine, but once we have PTH, what it does is that it gets those calcium in the urine and brings it back into the blood. Kasi ang goal ng parathyroid hormone mo, its goal is to increase the amount of calcium in the blood. Okay, please do remember that. PTH, the goal is to increase the amount of calcium in the blood. Kaya niya pinaparami yung osteoclast mo para sirain yung bones mo so that calcium in the bones will go to the blood. Okay? Another thing that it does, it indirectly increases the calcium uptake from the small intestine. Okay? So, kinukuha daw niya yung calcium na nadadigest natin from the small intestine. So, again, the goal of your parathyroid hormone is to increase the amount of calcium in the blood. And it does it in 3 ways. Activation of osteoclast, reabsorption of calcium from the urine, and increasing the calcium uptake from the small intestine. While your calcitonin naman is secreted by your C cells which are found in the thyroid gland. So calcitonin, letter C, C cells, they are found in the thyroid gland. And they are secreted when the blood calcium levels are too high. So what's the goal of calcitonin? The goal of calcitonin is to lower the amount of calcium in the blood. So opposite siya ni PTH. Calcitonin's goal is to lower the amount of calcium in the blood. And how does it do it? It rapidly lowers our blood calcium by inhibiting osteoclast activity. Okay, so it inhibits the osteoclast activity. As for our last slide, so here we have the response of the body. So let's start with this. If the blood calcium levels will go down, so bababa yung blood calcium mo, so what does the body want? The body will be able to detect that there is low blood calcium levels. So it will send a signal to your parathyroid gland and it will secrete your PTH. So what will PTH do? PTH will stimulate your osteoclast. So it will get calcium from the bones. Second, it will cause reabsorption of calcium in the urine, in the kidneys. And third, it will cause more absorption of calcium in our small intestine. And what will be its effect? The effect will be to increase the amount of calcium in the blood. Okay? So what if the amount of calcium naman is too high? If the amount of calcium in the blood is too high, it will be detected by the body as well. So the C cells in the thyroid gland will detect it and they will secrete calcitonin. And calcitonin will inhibit the amount of, inhibit the activity of the osteoclast. So if the osteoclasts are stopped, then calcium levels will go down. Yan. Okay. So that's it for the first video about bone physiology. I do advise that you read your book as well. And in the next video, we'll be talking about the different names of the bones already. So see you there.